It's time to revisit PCIe bandwidth testing. We're looking at the point at which a GPU can exceed the bandwidth limitations of PCIe Gen 3 slots, particularly when in by 8 or by 16 modes. This comparison includes dual Titan V's testing in by 8 and by 16 configurations, pushing the limits of the 1 GB per second per lane bandwidth restriction of the PCIe slots. We bought the first Titan V, then YouTube channel Bitsby Trippin sent us the second one, and we're now able to spread more load between two PCIe slots than we could before. Before getting to those, this coverage is brought to you by EVGA and their 1080 Ti SC2, which we've recommended fairly highly for its build quality and the ICX sensors, which are kind of fun to play with. You can check our full SC2 review for the 1080 Ti if you're curious to learn more, or you can click the link in the description below to find the product page for the 1080 Ti SC2. So the last time we did this test was on 1080 Ti's, and we only did a single card. With a single card in one slot between x16 and x8, we saw no more than generally a 1% difference between the two. Not that exciting, basically the same. We now have Titan V's, which are considerably more powerful in certain applications that can leverage them, and we also have two Titan V's. So we can really only leverage this in one application right now, and that's Ashes of the Singularity, as far as games go. Now, there are other applications like GPU Pi where you can leverage them in tandem, but it's not quite the same workload. PCIe bandwidth consumption is going to vary heavily on what's being used to test it. For example, the folks who do GPU mining often extend their cards via riser cable to a by 1 or by 4 slot, generally by 1. If you're doing that, you can tell already that that particular mining application doesn't really care about the bandwidth of the PCIe bus. So it will depend. Ashes tends to care, as we've seen in the past. Ashes also supports explicit multi-GPU via DirectX 12, and that means we can use two cards without a bridge between them and have them each in the slots, and they will communicate via the PCIe bus rather than an external bridge. This puts more load on that PCIe bus, and between two cards of this power class, we would expect that it might start hitting bandwidth limitations for really the first time we've seen almost ever on PCIe Gen 3 with two cards. So that's what we're testing today. To get everyone up to speed on the PCIe specs, versions 4 and 5 have been fast-tracked but aren't here yet and won't be for any reasonable period of time. The PCIe Gen 2 did about 500 megabytes per second per lane. Gen 3 does about 985 megabytes per second per lane, so we'll call that 1 gigabyte, and Gen 4 will do 1.97 gigabytes per second per lane, so call it 2 gigabytes. So again, previously, no more really than a 1% difference with this type of test, but now we're looking at how it performs here. Unfortunately, again, really only one game works for this. We tried several. So we tried Total War Warhammer DirectX 12 with all the different 8 betas that it has, and that does support explicit multi-GPU, but it will not detect both Titan V's and let them run without a bridge. We also tried Hitman and Deus Ex Mankind Divided, both of which are explicit multi-GPU ready, neither of which saw both Titan V's, and we did the same for Rise of the Tomb Raider, which is not a particularly great benchmark title to begin with, but that's fine because it also did not see two Titan V's. So we were left with Ashes and potentially synthetics. Further on this point, there's a potential limitation in that if you wanted to bridge these, you would have to use NVLink. A lot of you asked in our teardown, hey, what's that connector at the top of the card that doesn't look like SLI fingers? You're right, it's NVLink. It's a different protocol that nVidia put out not too long ago, about a year ago, and has greater bandwidth. If you want an NVLink bridge, it's $600, and we're not even sure if it's supported on this card right now, because we don't have one, because it's $600. So we're testing two of these, explicit multi-GPU in Ashes. Let's go through the numbers. Starting first with our dual versus single Titan V benchmark, we can look at this more of an SLI versus single card test for starters. Knock out 2 and 1. We overclocked the cards equivalently in each setup, then tested with 16 PCIe lanes available. The cards tested at 63 FPS average for the dual configuration, with lows at 25 and 22 for 1% and 0.1% low frame times respectively. The single Titan V configuration operated at 37.6 FPS average, immediately establishing that we are seeing large, noteworthy gains. Unfortunately, Ashes is where they stop, as we were unable to get the other games to detect both cards. The stock cards compare at 33 FPS average versus 57 FPS average, which is a noteworthy gain of 72%. Either way, we're already seeing at least 68% gains from adding a second card, which is significant. And no, the Titan V is not a gaming card, and you shouldn't do this, and it's not a gaming architecture, but it's still scaling in games, and that gives us the grounds to test whether the PCIe differences will scale. Moving on then to the PCIe bandwidth limitation testing, our charts now focus on by 16 and by 8 configurations, both overclocked to push the limits of the PCIe clock as it transacts between two devices. We're measuring 63 FPS average for two cards with an x16 interface, and measuring 56 FPS average for two cards with an x8 interface. That's about a 12 to 13% performance improvement with PCIe Gen 3 by 16, and is significant in illustrating that we're nearing the end of Gen 3's bandwidth, which is 15.75 gigabytes per second for 16 lanes. PCIe Gen 4 will push about 2 gigabytes per second per lane and will resolve any potential issues with these cards, but nVidia is also using, again, its $600 NVLink bridge to solve for this, except not in games, but in real applications that are intended for the card. As for single cards, we did not notice any appreciable differences between the single Titan V configurations in by 8 versus the single Titan V in by 16. It appears that we start encountering the most issues when transacting across two cards in explicit multi-GPU. The question becomes whether or not you'd notice this in other applications. Not every application cares about PCIe bandwidth. Mining is a great example, again, where GPU miners use by 1 slots for all their work. It's possible that applications more tailored for the Titan V would not run into this issue, as the two cards may not even need to talk to each other like they do with this game. If you use these types of devices for their intended scientific purposes, please let us know and we can do more bandwidth testing. Just let us know what applications you use, because we're not experts in that area, and that would give us a good starting point. The takeaway then is that this is really interesting information. We're getting data that shows that finally, after a couple of years of running this test every time a new high-end card comes out, we're seeing some performance delta when it comes to two of these transacting across the bus. It's one game, that's not representative of the whole, but for purposes of our audience, gaming, looking at a next-gen architecture, Volta, we can see that it's starting to approach the limitations of PCIe Gen 3. Now, how much that matters will largely be determined based on what nVidia does with this card in its gaming cards in the future, because Volta, as it stands today, is probably not going to make it into the next 1180 or whatever they call it. So we'll see how that changes things and see if it stays the same. But for now, it looks like we're actually approaching those limitations, which is pretty cool because we haven't been able to say that before. 12% difference is a big one in Ashes. So that's all for this one. As always, you can find more information in the article below, or just check the channel for all of the other videos on the Titan Vs. Subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net/modmat to pre-order this mod mat, or catch our upcoming recap of the live stream we did where we tried to take top 10 world records with Titan V overclocking on a 7980XE. That's all for this one. I'll see you all next time.